Well, welcome to the Church Office podcast.
My name's Gavin Smith, and if you're joining us on video, then here's a little wave.
We're excited to have Nigel Ring join us.
I've never actually heard the word wicked and accountant put in the same sentence.
Well, hello and welcome to the Church Office podcast. My name is Gavin Smith, and it's a joy today to welcome you to our Admin and Ops podcast. We love talking about the work of ministry behind the scenes in our churches. We love talking about church management, policy, all those things. And I've got two special guests today from the Information Commissioner's Office, Leanne and Harry. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hello, Bore da. Yes, good morning, and thank you so much for having us on the podcast today.
Oh, it's fantastic to have you. If you're a listener, you'll be aware that we put out a poll during April to say, what are some of your questions? What are some of the things that you find hard in this whole area of information and data? And we've had about 20 different responses back, similar questions. And so I really appreciate you both coming on today to kind of help us in this whole area of how we process information, how we store it, how we retention stuff. We've got stacks and stacks of questions to go for us. Leanne, do you want to kick us off with why is personal data and why is this topic so important?
Of course, by all means. So yeah, it's always good to go back to the start, I suppose, strip it back a little bit and ask the question of, why do we need to be thinking about information rights? Why is good information handling important, especially for us on the podcast today? I think it's fair to say that we very much live in a data-driven world. So processing and sharing our personal information, whether it's our names, our address, our date of birth, it helps make life easier. It helps us, it's more convenient for us and helps us feel more connected. But when we strip it back and we ask ourselves, what is data protection? What is GDPR all about? It's about people. It's about you, me, members of the church community. Data protection law is just making sure that people's data is being used properly and legally.
Yeah, that's right. That's so important, isn't it? And this is the whole area, I think, for churches where the numbers of questions that we've had in, it's one of those areas, and I feel it the same, that I feel like I lack a bit of confidence in, but it's one of these jobs that I constantly have to deal with because we have new members that join each week. We have people that go on missions and they leave and they go to different places. And so we're always having to kind of deal with this stream of information. And churches typically can be a little bit untidy with it, with, I don't know, pastoral care requests, prayer requests. I've seen things on WhatsApp. I've seen things where people, drop them on a notice board on a website or something like that. I mean, there's a whole range of ways that people want to, pass on their information to be prayed for or to be cared for by churches. Fill us in a little bit on how we do that effectively. I feel like we feel like a bit of amateurs, someone's saying in the question here. What do we do? Help us with the very basics here.
Not a problem at all. So it might be worth just bringing it back a little bit just to explain what personal data is, only because it's something that crops up quite frequently, Gavin. And we're fully aware that churches across Wales are going to process a lot of data on many different devices, some of which might be outside of scope of data protection laws. So in a nutshell, personal data is defined as any data that identifies a living individual. Now, we like to say there's kind of two types of personal data. We've got this standard personal data, which is the likes of our names, our addresses, our date of births. And then we also have something called special category data. And this is the type of data that the GDPR warrants further protection. So if Harry and I mentioned on this podcast today, special category data, what we mean is the more sensitive data, such as a person's religion, health information, race, or ethnicity. So we're fully aware that churches are very likely to hold a mixture of the two types of personal data. There is no one size fits all, I suppose, when it comes to data protection. Every church is going to be unique, and you and your listeners are going to know your church best. So I suppose the first step, if there is one, so to speak, is that we recommend that you make a list of what information you're actually holding or that you're planning to collect, and sort of generalize that information into groups. So instead of having a list of all the congregation email addresses that you hold, just kind of group them together to say, look, this is our congregation email list and this is where it's stored. Because then you're going to be able to know where it is, how much you hold, whether it's actually enough to actually fulfill your purposes. if you're holding too much, and where it is in case an individual asks you for a copy of it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you're kind of talking there, aren't you, about a bit of a kind of audit, isn't it? Is a starting point of what actual information are we collecting, holding, storing, what are we deleting? You know, all of those things is kind of a bit of an audit of, yeah. And I think lots of churches employ staff, so there's related stuff into that. We've got obviously the general information that we are collecting about our members through application forms and things like that. And you're right, this kind of specialty data then is the area then I think where we probably need the most help, because we've got good databases that run for people's communication preferences, their names, their addresses, their kids, and how they go to different clubs and what activities they join in within the church. But that specialized data is a bit that I guess most people are a little bit concerned about, and how we do that. So an audit is a good starting point, isn't it?
Most definitely. And a lot of the data that the church holds might not even be personal data, or if it is personal data, it might fall out of scope of data protection law. So it's really important to know kind of when it is and when it isn't in scope. So when you're making your list, just to let the listeners know, it doesn't apply to information relating to people who have sadly passed away. It also doesn't apply when you're using personal information purely for household purposes. So when making the list, you can forget things like your own holiday calendar, your own bank statements, or household affairs. Or similarly, if I'm a member of the congregation and I'm taking a video of the church choir and I'm only keeping it for my own personal use, or perhaps videoing a pastor delivering a sermon in a service, it's not going to go anywhere else. It's just going on my personal device. It will fall outside of scope of data protection and under something called domestic processing. So having that list is going to be able to, you're going to be able to identify what it is that you hold and where you're going.
And is there any resources that you guys have that will help people with that first step of audit? Have you got some guidance that people can go to? Harry, you're nodding. What have you guys got?
Absolutely, we do. Yeah, it's one of the things that we've kind of worked hard on actually over the past couple of years, maybe even longer now, to try and break down the legislation in a more digestible format. So on our homepage, actually, towards the bottom right, there's a kind of collection of links that are in almost this yellow section in the bottom right of the page. And one of them specifically is entitled Advice for Small Organizations. And I think a lot of the information in there could be quite applicable. There is kind of almost a beginner's guide, a lot of resources that break down kind of quick steps that you can look to take at the very start of the sort of the inception of what you're doing to try and work out what you have, and also how you're going to be able to manage it moving forward from a personal data perspective. That idea that Leanne has spoken about kind of building in data protection from an as early a stage as possible is something that we've always been kind of keen to endorse. It just kind of makes sense in many respects. It's probably going to save time, money, effort in the long run if you can have thought about those things at an earlier stage. And as I say, that advice for small organizations guidance, and particularly the kind of beginner's guide type resources, are a really good place to start, just to get yourself some initial familiarity with some of the concepts that crop up in data protection quite often, of which kind of storage, retention are quite frequently asked topics. So feature quite prominently in those resources.
Yeah, great. So, Leanne, you were talking about different types of, I guess, where there's consent for information. I feel like churches have been encouraged to kind of complete GDPR forms, giving consent to go onto databases and things like that. Privacy notices, and making sure that we inform people how we're using their data. That's essential, isn't it, in this part of what the early stages of developing information policies?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I suppose you kind of mentioned a few things there, which hopefully, if it's okay with you, we can kind of dissect a little bit, because lawful basis in itself is quite a big one for organizations, regardless of size. So I think one of the questions that come through is, what can we do with personal data, including that special category data, and what is the whole basis of consent and legitimate interest? So I'm happy to go into that a little bit.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah, so as the ICO, we wouldn't be able to tell you what you can and can't process for your church's needs, but any personal information that you're processing needs to be in line with data protection law, of course. So I suppose, Gavin, it's all about understanding that just because you want to collect data, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can and that you should. So what we say is that if you're holding personal information, or if you're planning to collect personal information, it must be in a way that's fair and lawful. And by fair, we mean that you should only be processing it in ways that people would reasonably expect. And by lawful, we mean that you've identified this valid reason for actually processing it. And under the legislation, it's called a lawful basis. And I'm happy to expand.
Keep going. This is helpful.
So many people, as you said, about consent, many people would have heard about consent and asking people's consent to process that information. Now, despite the many, many myths out there, consent is not the only option available. There are 6 other options available to churches when they're looking at their data sets and whether or not they can or can't process it. And some are going to be more appropriate than the others. So there are going to be instances where consent is the most appropriate. For example, if you're direct marketing someone. But if you're processing, I don't know, personal data of a pastor or some of the staff, the admin staff within the church, you may be able to rely on performance of a contract, for example. Or if you're retaining congregation details, it may be that you can rely on legitimate interest. So there are 6 options. So we always encourage you to look at the other options before assuming that consent is the most appropriate.
Yeah. That's helpful. I think churches always get nervous about which of those 6 does this fall into, and I think they often go, well, I'll just get consent for everything, and then I feel like I've covered everything. Is that necessary, or is that a helpful approach?
We have a very useful tool on our website called our Lawful Basis Interactive Tool, and that's going to be your sort of your one-stop shop. So we ask you a set of questions as to what types of data you're actually processing. And then at the end, it gives you like a traffic light system where perhaps consent might be in red to say, actually, I don't think this is most appropriate, but maybe legitimate interest might be in green, or performance of a contract might be in amber. So it's all about sort of assessing, depending on how you're answering the questions, it's all about understanding. But that tool is going to be the most useful thing for churches.
Perhaps the most common issue that you might run into if you choose to rely on consent is that obviously for it to be valid, it needs to be a sort of genuine free choice. So if someone were to remove consent that they'd given previously, then obviously you'd have to stop using their personal data in that way that you've collected it in the first instance. And so if that's likely to be impossible, then it might be a sign that consent maybe wouldn't have been a good idea in the first instance. We would say it in a circumstance where there's a specific legal obligation that an organization might adhere to. In that certain circumstance, it wouldn't make sense to ask someone for their consent to process personal data to meet that legal obligation, because if someone were to turn around and say, I don't want you to use it in that way anymore, you would have to turn around and say, well, I'm legally obligated to. So in a situation like that, legal obligation as a lawful basis is likely to be more appropriate. So again, it's kind of about having that foresight, if possible, to think ahead and say, well, moving forward based on how I'm going to be using that information, and also based on why I've collected it in the first place, what's likely to be the most appropriate lawful basis. But the tool that Leanne mentions revolves exactly around that, around asking those type of questions to hopefully help tease that out for you.
I think that's great. Yeah, that sounds great. And we'll put a link onto the website that kind of points to that tool. That sounds great, Leanne. Are there aspects of cloud versus local in terms of how we store some of the data? We've got a question sort of related to that. I guess people are asking, what does that look like?
You are right. I suppose we wouldn't be able to endorse a product, or we wouldn't be able to say whether or not cloud is the most appropriate. But what we say is that one of the GDPR principles is that personal data must be processed in a secure way. So it's all about making sure that the personal data you hold, and of course making that list is going to help you understand whether it's just the normal data or whether it's special category data. You're going to have to put the security measures in place to appropriately protect the level of data according to the level of risk that it poses.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and there are some really good cloud-based software that we could recommend. And on a previous podcast, we've chatted through those. And if you're interested in finding out more, then please do get in contact with us. Moving on then from the kind of lawful basis stuff into the kind of WhatsApp groups, we've had loads and loads of questions related to this. And I guess we're getting into kind of that special data category. Leanne, and WhatsApp groups pop up in churches, and prayer groups, support groups, one-to-one discipleship, all these kind of things pop up in these kind of this form of communication. Churches feel very uncomfortable about this whole thing. Who's the admin for this? Who runs this group? Who, how information should be deleted if people leave the group? Some churches, they never even started these WhatsApps, but they've evolved into something which is now processing and storing information. There was lots of questions about this. Have you guys got any thoughts about how churches manage that?
Yeah, I suppose it's certainly not something to be fearful of, is what I would say in the first instance. It can absolutely be managed. I would just say it's maybe something to take ownership of to an extent, or at least make a decision on from a church perspective. There's nothing inherently wrong with using a WhatsApp group in certain capacities, but you would obviously need to be mindful of potential data protection considerations. Usually, what we would say is, if someone is going to endorse the use of a WhatsApp group in a kind of a business capacity, so in the church's capacity, they're going to say, we'll use WhatsApp in this certain circumstance, then kind of take ownership for it and say, we'll be responsible for the information that's personal data that gets handled via that platform. So again, not something that can't necessarily happen, but if it is going to happen, maybe put a kind of policy in place, something written down that says what that group is intended to be used for and what type of information is going to be put on that group. And it should hopefully mean that it doesn't accidentally stray into another territory when certain things go on there that maybe are more inappropriate to be discussed in that kind of a platform. So nothing inherent. And again, it's kind of being considerative as well of people's rights in certain circumstances. Again, a common situation that we'll see occur, it's the question that crops up most often is about subject access requests. So when an organization receives a request for the personal data that they hold about a specific individual, if you're going to use a WhatsApp group as a club or an association, and you're going to say we're responsible for that, then in theory, some of the information that's on that WhatsApp group, if it's personal data about the individual that's made this request, you might need to provide in response in theory. So it's again having contingencies in place to make sure that if that were to happen, you'd be able to get access to some of the information that might be held on there and provide it to somebody if that were to be the case. So again, nothing to be sort of inherently fearful of at all. It's just about making a decision and saying, if we are going to use them, we will use them in as sort of the most appropriate and proportionate way possible.
I was just going to say that every church is going to have, as Harry mentioned there, a social media policy in place, outlining the responsibilities of everyone within those groups, regardless of who is admin in them, and what the church's expectations are as well. That's going to kind of help you demonstrate the accountability principle, which is that underpinning principle that puts an obligation on every organisation, regardless of size, to demonstrate exactly what they are doing to us as the regulator, but also to those individuals whose data you're processing. I was just going to touch upon something you mentioned, Gavin, around prayer requests and using WhatsApp for prayer requests, because I suppose, and again, this is not us kind of putting you off it, it's just looking at some considerations maybe prior to setting up WhatsApp group for that purposes. It's always worth asking whether the church have explored other options, firstly. Is WhatsApp going to be the most secure way of processing that special category data? Or is there a less privacy intrusive way, for example, verbally? And the reason I say that is because if I'm submitting a verbal prayer request to a pastor, it's not going to be written down anywhere. It means that it's not part of the church's relevant finance system, which means it's out of scope of GDPR. Or alternatively, a different or less privacy intrusive way could be me emailing the pastor with some of the information relating to the individual. And then after the prayer request has been given or delivered in the sermon, then it can be deleted afterwards. And I suppose that some of the questions is, have they thought about who has access to the data, and is it appropriate and fair for potentially anyone with access to a church member's phone to have access to Harry's health conditions, for example, that could be in a prayer request?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions on that, are we? I think people need to go away and think about how they are using these groups, how they need to, look at alternative options of what you're saying. And I think that sounds right. I think we do live in a kind of quick digital age now, don't we? Where, going and seeing a pastor and booking in to see someone for a prayer request is less and less now, where it's more of, here's a quick WhatsApp, would you pray for me, or would you pray for my friend or my mum who's got this, who's got cancer, and and you're like, oh wow, okay, there's a lot of information here. So worthwhile for people to stop and just go, okay, let's think about a strategy for our church of how we do this and do this well. So that covers kind of some of the WhatsApp questions, and it's surprising there was a lot around that, wasn't there? So I think if you've got any more specific questions that you'd like to ask, then please get in contact at questions@thechurchoffice.co.uk. We can pass them on to you, and if we can serve you specifically in this area and helping you to kind of refine that a little bit, then please get in contact. There was a question then. Let me look at the next one. What's the most appropriate way to get contact details for online? So we've got online storage, the PECR direct marketing. Leanne, fill us in a bit about this.
Okay, so thank you to whoever submitted this question. It was definitely a question that Harry and I read in many different ways. So I think, Harry, if you may have a different idea of how this is interpreted, please feel free to jump in. But we wasn't sure whether the individual meant merely just inputting personal data from paper copy into a digital format and storing it online, or whether they were looking to actively look for people online to send them marketing material, for example.
Yeah.
So I suppose I could answer both of them, or Harry and I could kind of just delegate it between the both of us. But what I'd encourage church managers or anyone who's responsible for data protection in the church is to really think about why you want the personal information. What are you going to do with it? Are you using it so you can build a spreadsheet to market people?
Yeah.
Or are you just trying to get hold of someone who is in a Bible study class and you need to let them know that Bible class studies have been cancelled next week? And there's a massive difference between the two, which is why I'm asking that question. If you're looking to send out marketing material to people, this is going to fall under another piece of legislation the ICO regulates called the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we do shorten it to PEC regs or PECA, and there are a number of rules under that legislation you need to follow. I won't go into the full list, but I suppose one of the main ones, possibly the most important one, is that if you're looking for people online and you get their email address that clearly identifies them as an individual, as an example, leanne.meredith@ico.org.uk, you're going to need their consent prior to contacting them. However, if it's just a generic email address, for example, wales@ico.org.uk, you won't.
Yeah.
If you're not directly marketing them at all, and you have a relationship with the person, and like I said, you're just trying to get a message out there to say Bible study classes are not on this week, it's likely to fall under a service message. So PECA rules aren't going to apply to you.
Yeah. Great. Harry, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose maybe fundamentally in the first instance as well, the kind of consideration of what constitutes marketing as well. Because I appreciate that a lot of the time, some of the communications that you might send out won't necessarily be tailored around offering like a product necessarily or a service as you might typically associate with marketing messages, but they can extend as well to just the promotion of aims and ideals. So it's a bit broader than just selling a particular product or a service. It can also be about, like I say, promoting your aims and ideals. So it's important to consider that too, dependent on the type of messages you're sending out. And yes, if you are contacting individuals specifically by email, so a personal email address, then yeah, that's where you'll need consent likely. If not, then you potentially wouldn't. And also if you're looking at doing other things like, postal marketing as well, isn't necessarily drawn in those regulations that Leanne mentions, the privacy and electronic communication regulations, the electronic element suggesting that they only apply to those electronic communications like emails, text messages, phone calls, and less to kind of postal marketing that might be occurring as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the other thing this question might be getting to is, I guess, on lots of church websites, they've got kind of, I'm new here, I'm interested in kind of finding out more about faith. And often, people have on our website, we've got one, with contact information. If you'd like to find out more, it's a name, it's an email address. And then you're asking people to kind of tick whether they've looked at the privacy policy about how we're going to, we're linking on there our privacy notice. And then people are kind of sending those in, and we're able to then go and contact them. So some churches might have that kind of system, and I guess that's a useful way if you're running an alpha course that's running out there for the community for people who are outside of the church. Then use of the website and then that way to gather information is fine. It's not in sense direct marketing. It's more, okay, someone's interested and they've given them their details so that we're able to contact them, and I think that's legitimate. So we haven't touched on this, and I don't know whether we had a question on this, but in terms of people putting together a privacy notice and making people aware of that, I think those documents are actually really, really helpful. And it's really interesting to read different churches' privacy notices. Leanne, have you got any thoughts about, because that stems again from the audit of what we've been talking about, isn't it? As to why we collect people information, what we're going to do with it, how we use it. We had to adapt ours because we added some CCTV to the building in certain points, and we've had to update it again. And so fill us in a little bit about kind of privacy notices and how people might want to start to write those and get those going.
Absolutely. And Harry, feel free to jump in here, because I know that you've led on some of the really important work that we've been doing with the privacy notice generator, which I'll mention in a little bit. But under GDPR, under data protection law, individuals have that right to be informed. So it's really important that organisations are very clear, very open and transparent with individuals as to how they're collecting the data, how much they're collecting, where it's going, is it being shared anyway, for example. And they understand, so the individuals understand exactly what it is that organisations are doing, so that it's fair and that it's lawful. We've I know that privacy notices is something that a lot of people don't have time to do, which is why we've currently put together a suite of resources, including this generator tool on our website, and it includes. Well, Harry, I don't know, Harry, if you want to come in on some of the questions that it asks and how it's kind of built.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had for quite a while a kind of template privacy notice that was available on the website that was kind of relatively sort of helpful but generic in its nature. It sort of gave you the kind of fundamental questions that you would need to ask when you're creating a privacy notice, and gave you a little bit of a template to work off. What we did off of the back of that was to try and help make it kind of more specific, more kind of tailored towards the type of work that different organizations would have been part of. And so came up with this idea of a privacy notice generator, or at least our team that deal predominantly with smaller organizations did. I don't want to take too much of the credit, seeing as I wasn't involved with a lot of that process. But yes, they did some real great work. And it basically splits things up into different sections, different kind of things that you might be doing with personal data. It will ask you a question to see whether you collect that type of personal information, and then it will kind of design a privacy notice that is based around the information that you input into it. It will then pop that out at the end, and you'll be able to kind of add your own branding to it and then put that on your website. Over the course of summer this year, we're hoping to put one out or put a few out, put a collection of them out actually, that are targeted at specific sectors as well. So we have kind of general business one that exists currently, and one that exists internally for kind of staff / volunteer information. But over the course of the summer, hoping to put out ones that are tailored at the kind of charity sector. There's some that are tailored at the health social care sector as well. There's a kind of group of them that should be launching together, but fundamentally revolve around asking you key questions about what type of personal data you hold, what you'll be using it for, and then aiming to kind of make that process of drafting privacy information more straightforward. I think probably one of the most significant things to say when it comes to privacy information, I think, is that when privacy notices get mentioned, I think people's thoughts in the first instance turn to those kind of long 50-page documents that you might see from time to time when you're agreeing to sign up to something with a kind of real big company. And really, that's kind of not what privacy information needs to be necessarily for the vast majority of organizations. It's fundamentally about being clear with people about what you're doing with their personal information. If you don't do that much with it, or are able to summarize it fairly swiftly, then there's no reason that you can't do that in a kind of much shorter statement or document. And I think the privacy notice generator hopefully helps to prove that to some extent.
I love that. It sounds great. And I think that really serves people, because I think lots of churches can think, right, I need to buy some lawyers' time to produce these policies, and then these policy documents come back, and they're almost very thorough. They're very corporate, and yeah, they are transparent. But you look at them and you go, this feels like it's not a usable document. I mean, they probably cover all the bases. But actually to have tools on your website that we can go to and get something that actually is going to serve our church members more effectively, because we can clearly customize what we're doing and explain what we're doing, being transparent about what we're doing, sounds great. So yeah, love to link people into that tool. And you're saying that's available at the minute, Harry? That's on your website?
Absolutely, yeah. It's been published recently, the kind of general business one and the one that's internal for your own staff information. And then over the course of summer this year, there'll be a few more that are sector specific that might even be more helpful.
Now, I've never had one of these before where somebody's asked for the personal data that we hold on them. So, an information request. I think every church manager is slightly fearful of that day that's going to come. It's been 4 or 5 years and we haven't had one. How do people even start to think about doing one of those if that comes in? Help us with that area, guys. Who wants to stab at that first?
Do you want me to jump in on that one, Leanne?
Happy to, yeah, that's fine. I'll add to your comments.
Yeah, so I think it kind of starts, like Leanne mentioned, almost at the beginning of the podcast, with having things in place prior to the request being received, ideally.
Okay.
If you practice good records management, have an understanding of the type of personal data that you hold, and have it stored in a way that makes it kind of clear and easily accessible to you, then obviously if that day does come around and a request comes in, the likelihood is you'll be able to find the information that somebody wants a lot kind of quicker and in a more straightforward way.
Yeah.
In the first instance, I think it's probably important to understand that this ability to access your own information technically falls under the right of access. That's where it falls within the data protection legislation. If someone were to make a request to you, it's commonly referred to as a subject access request.
Okay.
Neither of those terms necessarily need to be mentioned in order for it to be a valid request. So in theory, there's a chance that as a church, you might already have dealt with one without necessarily having labeled it as a subject access request. If someone just said, I want to see this information about me, or a copy of this document that you might have, then there's a chance that that technically was a subject access request.
Okay.
There is a calendar month timeframe. So when someone makes that request, technically you need to look at getting the information back to them in most circumstances within a calendar month. So obviously we usually say if you have a kind of internal structure or policy for dealing with a subject access request, if you look at 28 days, then you're obviously never going to be longer than a calendar month. So you'll always be within that time scale. So as a kind of ideal practical thing to work towards, that's probably a good time frame to associate with. When someone makes the request, look at it, make sure you understand it and what information it relates to specifically, because of course you're only obligated to send them the information that they've asked for. So if someone uses the wording subject access request, don't immediately think this now means I've got to search absolutely everything I hold. If someone just asks for one thing in particular, you of course only need to provide that one particular thing.
Yeah.
Importantly as well, I suppose, ID to like a valid request in the first instance. Make sure that if someone is making a request, you're confident that that person genuinely is the person that the information relates to as well. If you're happy that the request is valid, you've worked with that individual, you've maybe talked to them through that email address several times before, that's probably going to be good enough in a lot of circumstances to know, okay, we're happy this request comes from someone that we work with regularly, we're confident that is that person, we know where we hold the information about them. You can then look at supplying it back to them. Usually you'll be doing it in like an electronic form. Importantly, it's information that people are entitled to, not necessarily documents as a whole. So if there's a big long email that has one paragraph in it that relates to someone really clearly, then it's just that paragraph in theory that someone is entitled to, not necessarily the email as a whole. So that's the kind of time frame to work to. That's the kind of initial things to think about. But generally, in terms of dealing with things, if you know what you have and you make sure that you only get what you need to in the first instance, the likelihood is if a request comes through, you might actually be able to deal with it in a far more straightforward manner than you might think. Leanne, I don't know if you've got anything to add on top of that.
I just wanted to say, I think obviously staff training is going to be really important here because, as Harry mentioned, they don't have to mention subject access, data protection, or the right of access. So it's going to be really important that staff members or even volunteers know how to identify a request, because it doesn't actually have to be submitted in writing either. It could be a verbal request, or it could be through email, or it could even be through Facebook or WhatsApp, for example. So it's really important, because it's only a calendar month you have to respond in most circumstances. It's really important that staff know how to pick it up and where to deliver it to. Who's the best person to respond to this request? And I suppose the only other thing is that there is a wealth of guidance on our website to help you. So if you ever do have a SAR or a subject access request, please don't panic. Please pick up the phone to us if you need to. We'd much rather you contact us and say, Leanne, I really need help with this. This is the first one. Please, can you help me? We have, I think it's like 5 or 6 steps on our website to help you as well. But we'd much rather an open, honest conversation with you rather than you burying your head in the sand and then risking an ICO complaint or an investigation.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. And that goes on to the next question that someone's asked here is getting things wrong. What are the consequences of getting things wrong was one of the questions came in. Fill us in a little bit on that. Nobody wants this.
It is something that we have quite a lot.
Okay.
We are all human. Okay, we all make mistakes, and I think we can't really talk about things going wrong without talking about a data breach. So if Gavin, if it's okay with you, I'll kind of
fill us in. Yeah.
lead on to the consequences, so to speak. So if any listeners today, if you find out a personal data breach has happened, so if data has been lost or stolen, destroyed, or inappropriately accessed by a member of the public, for example, who wasn't supposed to have had access to it, this is what we refer to as a personal data breach. And under the legislation, organisations in certain circumstances need to report it to us within 72 hours. So again, staff training is going to be really important to make sure that they know how to identify a breach and what to do with it if things do go wrong. Because those 72 hours aren't working hours, unfortunately. They roll over to evenings, weekends, bank holidays, Christmas Day. So knowing what to do and the steps to take when things go wrong is going to help you be as accountable and transparent as possible. I suppose the most practical advice is always, please don't panic. And that's going to be the most human response, and we totally understand that. But we are a very pragmatic regulator. And as I've said before with the subject access things, we'd much rather an open, honest conversation with a church to say, okay, this has gone wrong. How has it gone wrong? And what steps have you now put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again? Rather than you burying your head in the sand and then opening yourselves up to scrutiny or enforcement action.
There's sorry, Gavin. There's a threshold that exists within the legislation for when something needs to be reported to the ICO. That actually has kind of a little funny inbuilt double negative in it, where it says that all breaches need to be reported to the ICO unless they are unlikely to pose a risk to the individual involved. And the common question that kind of totally understandably crops up quite a lot is, well, how do we know if that's likely to pose a risk to the individual? Usually, I think I split things in half a lot of the time and think about, well, how sensitive is the information in and of itself on the one hand? And then on the other hand, what's the kind of contextual factors that we're looking at? Because there's every chance that something might be reasonably sensitive, but if it's dealt with in a way that really kind of manages the situation quite quickly, then the likelihood is that it's actually probably not going to pose a risk to anybody. You can also have the flip, though, of course, where something might seem in some circumstances fairly menial, but because of the context in which the breach has occurred, it actually poses perhaps more of a problem. So, if an address were to be disclosed to someone where there is like clearly a previously like bad relationship that's existed and that person had moved as a result, then although you might say it's just an address, and in some circumstances, if there were no relationship, the risk wouldn't be there, the context in that situation actually makes it slightly more problematic, and that probably would be something that you'd look at reporting. So it's important to kind of weight both of those things, the sensitivity of the information and the context, fairly equally when you come to look at something and think, is that risk going to be there, and do I potentially need to report something to the ICO? But really, it is that kind of almost 3-step process of, okay, how do I contain what's happened now as a result, as kind of step one? Step two, what can I do to prevent this type of thing from happening again in the future? Both of which kind of Leanne mentioned some really great bits of advice for. And then also, does this now, as a result of what's happened, need to be reported to the ICO in the first instance as well?
And how does that report have to happen? Is it just through the website or through email? Is that that's a report, you've got 72 hours and you need to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, there's a reporting form on our website that makes things nice and straightforward. So that's where I would say to go in the first instance. Asks kind of really set, clear questions that just require a few lines of information. Obviously, the more kind of context we can give, minus any personal data, which we don't necessarily need to see, just information about the incident, what's happened, and the steps that have been taken to kind of address it now that it has occurred, are kind of useful to us in terms of looking at it. But yes, a form on our website, and it's hopefully reassuring to say that in many circumstances, a lot of the personal data breaches that we receive and that are looked at by our personal data breach team can be kind of dealt with by just providing advice and recommendations to an organization that can then be kind of interpreted and acted upon moving forward. Typically, that's how we're able to resolve a lot of the incidents that get reported to us as personal data breaches.
Yeah. And have you guys had any examples of churches, or I guess other examples where that has happened, that you might be able to give a bit of advice about, Leanne?
Yeah, of course. I wouldn't single out churches in particular, or this sector. We often find that organisations go wrong when it comes to things like properly protecting the devices, where they may have information on a laptop, but they might not be strong enough passwords on that laptop, or they're sharing the passwords with people that they shouldn't be sharing it with. There's also been instances where I've gone out on advisory visits in the past to assess an organisation's compliance. And they've been really eager to show us, state-of-the-art technology, encryption technology, but then they'll hold paper copies of the data online in a filing cabinet, and then the keys to the filing cabinet are on a hook just above it. So I suppose they've fallen short with common sense a little bit, with making sure that the appropriate security measures are in place.
Yeah, that's useful. Go on, Harry.
Yeah, what we do have on our website as well is a kind of tool that demonstrates of the reports that we've received, what proportion relate to what type of incident. So you can kind of see the most common personal data breaches that occur.
Okay.
As Leanne mentioned, the security of devices is definitely one. Data emailed to an incorrect recipient is kind of top of that list, as you'd probably expect, because it's the kind of thing that can come about as a result of human error. And obviously, these things are difficult to mitigate for, to an extent, of course. Everybody makes mistakes, like Leanne mentioned earlier. Having that kind of training in place, policies and procedures. We say in a lot of circumstances that disabling something like autofill might be kind of useful too. I appreciate the kind of convenience of it in certain circumstances, but when you've got two people with a very similar name, sometimes it can lead to mistakes that the kind of extra couple of seconds of typing an email address or copying it from the right place might help sort of prevent an incident, are probably worthwhile. But yeah, on there's some useful information to kind of give people a bit of a background in terms of the type of incidents that come up most prominently, and then maybe that helps to kind of target the security measures that you put in place to particularly try and avoid those types of incidents.
Yeah, that's useful. And I think you're right. It does go back to kind of staff training. It goes back to the audits, what we started talking about right at the start, of what information do we have? Where is it stored? Is it stored on individual devices, or is it on a central database? Is it in the cloud? Those questions are key, aren't they? And I think, we've seen in the past pastors who've had their bags stolen with their laptops in the car, and they've left it in there. And again, that's another issue, saying actually, if you've got a laptop, then you've got a device that you're taking home and you're transferring back and forth from the office, it's got to be secure. And there are general things here of don't leave it behind. It needs to be locked away. It needs to be in a safe, secure place. And if somebody does get a laptop stolen and they're concerned about the password, is that one of the things that you think, oh, we need to report this within the 72 hours? Would that fall into that kind of category?
Again,
As
it's
part of
quite.
the, oh, sorry to
Oh,
interrupt, Harry. As part of the online reporting tool that Harry mentioned there, we also have a self-assessment checklist. So it asks you a set of questions to tell you whether or not a breach is reportable. So we're not expecting you to be experts. If something like that does happen, pick up the phone to us, have a conversation with us, or alternatively, go on our self-assessment, explain what it is that's gone wrong, and then they'll tell you whether or not to report it. If it is reportable, they'll send you onto our online breach form. You could fill in exactly what's happened, and then we can go from there.
Okay, brilliant. And I hope this podcast will kind of get rid of some of the fears that there might be of picking up the phone and emailing in. It's like, oh, I don't know if I can interact with the ICO. I'm going to be told off, or we're going to get something wrong. But hopefully that you guys are here to help and are developing tools to help, and that's wonderful to hear. Harry, one of the questions that comes in from lots of churches we've seen here is, do I need to register with the ICO? Some are saying I'm exempt. Different churches that we know are saying, well, I've registered, and others saying, well, I haven't, I don't need to. Tidy that all up for us. What do churches need to do here?
Great question. It kind of relates to something that Leanne said earlier, which is that there's not necessarily a perfect one-size-fits-all approach for all churches across the board, but there are probably a few key pointers to consider in the first instance. So, importantly, if a church has CCTV, then they will need to register in that circumstance. CCTV almost acts as a bit of a kind of catch-all. If you have CCTV, that's a really easy way to know, yes, we'll probably need to pay the data protection fee.
Yeah.
Also, if a church provides pastoral care, as I'm conscious that maybe quite a lot of them will do, so counselling, emotional, social and spiritual support, and hold those records electronically, then they'll be required to pay the fee as well. So those are maybe two big areas that would help you to immediately know whether or not you'd need to pay the data protection fee. There is an exemption that exists for not-for-profit organisations. So if neither of those two apply, it might be that a church can rely on the not-for-profit exemption and potentially wouldn't need to pay the fee as a result of that. Okay. There are a few different criteria that fall underneath that not-for-profit exemption. So I would say on our website, in our guide to the UK GDPR, there's a specific section on the data protection fee. And I would say have a look in there and specifically at the not-for-profit exemption. If you're happy that that applies and you don't collect personal data for any of those first two reasons, pastoral care or CCTV, there might be more of a chance that you wouldn't necessarily need to pay the fee. It's not unusual that an organization, a group or association would necessarily need to pay the data protection fee. It applies fairly broadly across the country to all different types of organizations that collect personal data electronically, importantly. And it's in different kind of tiers as well. So for a lot of churches, if they're smaller organizations, for the most part, smaller groups, it might be that they fall into the kind of lowest tier of paying the data protection fee, which would either be £40 or £35 by direct debit. But in answer to the question, I think pastoral care, CCTV are likely to make it an obligation. If neither of those two, maybe not under the not-for-profit exemption.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think that does probably catch all there. So if you haven't registered, then please look into that. Be encouraged to have a look into that. Moving on then to retention and dealing with data, historic data possibly. We've had loads and loads of questions about this. I'm looking at data retention. I'm trying to get a definitive view on as to what data I need to retain as archive records relating to people, DBSs, safeguarding. So the church deals with a whole host of information there. Yeah, I mean, we should have a data retention policy, shouldn't we, in place that does outline what churches are doing. So give me a general overview then of what we need to be thinking about in this area here. Harry, you on this one?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really good question. And we've mentioned the principles a couple of times throughout the course of the podcast. And they really do quite a lot of the work when it comes to outlining the main considerations that an organization, a church will probably need to think about when it comes to having personal data. There are two of the principles that I would say are probably most relevant when it comes to collecting and retaining personal data in the first instance. So it probably makes sense to talk about both of them.
Yeah.
They're technically in the legislation talked about as kind of purpose limitation and data minimization. Oh, sorry, storage limitation, I should say, and data minimization.
Yeah.
Data minimization, right? Unfortunately, the principles, although they kind of have more complex names to some extent, the actual wording is maybe more simplistic than you might think in the first instance. This idea of data minimization really just is about collecting in the first instance exactly what you need, and ideally no more than that, because that's going to help you with retention in the long run if you don't capture more than you need in the first instance.
Yeah.
So it's about having that little think at the outset. What do we really need to be able to capture to fulfill whatever purpose it is that we have for collecting that personal data in the first instance?
Yeah.
If you're providing safeguarding support or going on a trip with young children or young adults, then what information do you need to have to be able to make that a successful venture?
Yeah.
Ideally, don't capture something just because it's kind of a nice to have. But if there's a genuine kind of foreseeable need to collect that information, then of course you'll likely be able to do so. There will be circumstances where something might not end up being that useful, but if you've kind of needed to collect it in the first instance because reasonably there could have been a good reason for having it, that typically will be fine. You know, if you're taking people on a trip and you need to know kind of allergy requirements because of the fact that they're going to be having a meal, it might never come up that the fact that someone has a peanut allergy is particularly relevant, but it might be important. And so collecting that in the first instance is fine. So if in the first instance, before you even collect anything, before that kind of question of how long should I keep something for even crops up, make sure ideally that you're only capturing what it is that you actually need.
Yeah.
If you then look at retention, which falls under that kind of storage limitation principle, there's this idea that you only need to only need to keep hold of personal data for as long as you need it, for no longer than is necessary, is the actual wording of the legislation. Now, obviously, that kind of leaves it open to interpretation to some extent, because that will vary from church to church, I would imagine, in a lot of circumstances, how long you need to specifically hold something. Ideally, if there's some kind of legal requirement or some kind of regulatory requirement for you to hold something for a set period of time, then obviously that does quite a lot of thinking for you, because the legislation that we look at will just say, well, that's if that requirement exists, you'll be able to hold it for that long. If not, it's about thinking justifiably, how long might you need it for whatever purpose you had for collecting it in the first instance? If your relationship with someone ends and the personal data that you captured was kind of important to maintaining that relationship, then you might hold it for a little bit of time outside of that, you know, weeks or months, but you certainly wouldn't look to hold on to that personal data for years and years. And importantly, not indefinitely as well. Don't just keep something because there's a real small, minute chance that it might become relevant. If you've gotten rid of something because you've had an identifiable retention policy that's based in kind of firm reasoning off of the back of the type of personal data and the experiences that you've had previously, the chances are that if it were to ever come up, then you'd likely be able to say, well, we deleted it in line with our retention policy. And that would just be looked at as a kind of reasonable perspective from our view. It's not an expectation that you would hold something indefinitely, as I say, just in case it were to crop up far later down the line.
Yeah, that's helpful. Anything to add on to that, Leanne?
I was just going to echo what Harry said, really. You know, by adopting good practice at the start, only keeping what's necessary, keeping that data to a minimum, is going to save you time and money when it comes to those things like subject access requests, because you're not going to have to set time up of your working day or ask someone else to help sort through reams and reams of information to be able to provide a copy of the information to a data subject.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So things like health records that people might do, or prayer requests and that, I've seen some churches have data retention for, years, or as long as they remember still. For some, it's 6 months. Is there any guidance around that kind of special data, if you like, how long a church should keep hold of that?
And unfortunately not. There isn't anything under the legislation that states how long documents need to be kept for. As Harry mentioned there, under the principles, it just says for no longer than is necessary.
Yeah.
To help organisations and churches alike across Wales with this, what we kind of do, we kind of break it down into 3 points. So we kind of say, right, ask yourselves, do you have a legal requirement to keep this data? So for example, financial information, you might have to keep for 7 years.
Yeah.
As an example. If you don't have a legal requirement to keep that data, do you have a lawful basis? Do you have that valid reason to be able to continue processing the information? So it could be legitimate interest, it could be consent, they've got that 6 options available to you. If you don't have a legal requirement or you don't have a lawful basis, it's at that point we say, okay, you'll need to securely destroy the information.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And there's questions about safeguarding in that first question of how long do we keep that for, and I guess I've seen some policies, I think our policy might say like 75 years or something. Any particular advice with that, because we could organize a young people's trip away, and an incident may come up 25 years later, that relates to something that happened on that trip that that was awful. How and that data of who was there, what young people were there, what leaders were there, the center that we went to, all of those things become important at that point, don't they? So is there any guidance on that kind of stuff? Are we just saying, because financial stuff is straightforward, isn't it? 7 years, membership, people leaving a church, that's relatively straightforward. Great. Yeah. When they leave, then you can, ask them, do you want them to delete their data? Do they want to stay on the mailing list for events? They may have those kind of options at that point, but that very sensitive stuff on, safeguarding stuff, is that just a keep forever?
Again, it's another great question. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a keep forever type situation. We'd probably say that wouldn't necessarily be the case for any of the personal data that you hold. Right. However, it's entirely understandable that that type of information you might look to retain for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
If there is anything that you're going to hold on to for a longer period of time, particularly if it's especially sensitive, at that point, I would suggest making sure that you really try, if possible, to trim it down. So you only keep what is absolutely necessary to something that might occur far, far later down the line. As I say, it needs to be the case that you have to retain something for way longer. Make sure that you're kind of stripping that back to being the real kind of fundamentals. No specific timeframes associated with it necessarily, but it's the same kind of principle that would apply to any personal data that applies equally to more sensitive information, that it's held for no longer than is necessary. It's just obviously there would be slightly more kind of strict expectations more broadly, I would probably say, that work is done to make sure that that's kind of reduced down to only holding what it is that you really, really need in those circumstances.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's great. Some of the questions then about relating here. So how long should the church keep information relating to members' prayer requests? So again, that's going to come in various different forms, whether it's, the verbal, the written down, the card in a box to say, please pray for me. We've got an app that we use where people can make requests on a kind of private church app. What are people's thoughts on that?
Again, another great question. I think for prayer requests, I suppose the question would be, is there an argument that those kind of bits of personal information need to be kept for potentially a shorter period of time? Certainly there's some of your safeguarding records. I suppose it really is the case of what's the intention in terms of how that information, when it's collected, is going to be used. Again, also being mindful of the things that Leanne mentioned earlier, which is that some of the ways that you might receive a request, the legislation might not necessarily apply to them. So if someone were to say something verbally, then obviously it's not recorded down for you as a church. And so as a result, you won't have to consider retention, of course, for that type of information, which is different to if you're kind of proactively asking someone to submit something to you that has kind of names attached. Again, an important consideration there. If something is kind of nameless, it's not personal data if it can't be related back to a specific individual. Again, retention is going to be less relevant. Really, it depends. Individually, I understand it will completely vary from church to church, but what is your intention for how that prayer request is going to be used? If it's in a kind of one-off service environment, then is there an argument to say that it doesn't necessarily need to be retained for much longer than that? If it's something that's going to be kind of more continual and more ongoing, then yes, there's every chance it might need to be held for a little bit of a longer period. If that's going to be the case, again, it kind of relates to what I was saying previously about the kind of safeguarding information. Is there any way that it can be kind of limited, the amount that's retained for a longer period, so that it's maybe less sensitive than it was in the first instance, potentially? All of those are kind of considerations that you can make. And I suppose, practically speaking, if it's possible to kind of have different channels for receiving prayer requests that will make it nice and clear how long certain bits will be held for, dependent on how they're submitted to a church, then that's even more ideal, because it'll be nice and clear to people when they provide that information, how long it's going to be held for, dependent on how it's provided to the church in the first instance.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. Anything else on that, Leanne?
I was just gonna say that last point that Harry mentioned there, it kind of all ties back to processing information in a way it's fair and lawful. So what is it that people expect? Are you telling people up front, this is how we're going to process your data and how long for? As long as people are aware of what's going on. And of course, you all understand, all churches understand that it could be in scope of a subject access request. An individual submitting a request know that that message could be released to the individual who the prayer request is about.
Yeah.
I suppose it all comes back to transparency, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Letting people know how we are, dealing with their data. Yeah, that's great. Some specifics in here. So, how should we keep emails for staff that have left the church? And I think some churches are not particularly good at this as well. So they might, they don't have the structure in place to have a formal church email address. So they might be using their personal one while they're working or volunteering, if you like, and that might be more of a case for a church. Any advice for churches in those areas around emails?
Yeah, again, a really great question, because there are a kind of whole host of considerations, maybe in the first instance, that can be kind of especially beneficial to bear in mind when we're thinking about the kind of personal data breach aspect as well. I would usually say, ideally, an email isn't necessarily to be used as a kind of document storage solution in a lot of circumstances. If something comes through as an email and you think that there is a likelihood that you'll need to retain some of the information within that email or an attached document, is it possible to, in the first instance, take that out of an email account and maybe save it somewhere locally, either on a church system, or even if it has to be the case, on a personal device, as long as that's kind of set out clearly in a policy and it's understood that although it's on your personal device, still it's being held for church business. So the church is the as we would refer to them, data controller, the organization responsible for that information. If that's the case, then that kind of helps to deal with a lot of issues that might potentially come up. If someone accidentally sees the email that's sat in someone else's email account, if they're looking at over the shoulder one day accidentally for something else that's in there, and they see that information, it kind of helps to circumvent that come up as an issue. In terms of the specific question that was asked in terms of how long emails need to be kept, I suppose it goes back to the overarching principle of don't keep something for longer than you need it. So if a staff member leaves and it's just general communications, there is a little bit about them, but fundamentally it doesn't need to be held for any kind of employment or volunteer obligations, then there's a chance that you may well be best off just getting rid of that information.
Yeah.
However, if there is a genuine need, of course, it can probably be held onto, but would then go back to what I said previously, which is if it's a document or a section of information that's of kind of real importance and note, is sat in an email account the best place for it, or could it maybe be held elsewhere? Those are probably going to be the main things that I would say to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's helpful. We've covered some stuff on the residential trips. How is it best for churches to store and process members? Prayer requests. Well, we've covered that again, haven't we? Do you have any suggestions on a wise and appropriate way to deal with historic emails between a pastor and a congregation? So there may be, so pastors do change, and we do see some of those cycles where somebody might be in a place for 4 years, and yeah, that sharing of information to the next pastor and how those that kind of correspondence. Again, thoughts on that? People are obviously concerned about that email side of things.
Yeah, again, I think it's about kind of again having those expectations from the start, I suppose. If it's understood that that information or those emails are being exchanged by the church, and there is a need for a new pastor to see those email exchanges because it gives them important, like contextual information that they'll maybe need to be able to help someone out from a safeguarding perspective or to tailor a service appropriately, then generally speaking, I don't think there would be too much of an issue whatsoever in those emails being retained and shared amongst the church, the people, the pastor in this circumstance that needs to see it. I don't think that's going to be too problematic at all. Obviously, if there are some communications that are really intended to be very specifically confidential or a kind of one-off occurrence that is unlikely to be of much relevance moving forward, then obviously less need for that information to be held onto and maybe should be gotten rid of in a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
But of course, going to vary quite drastically, potentially dependent on what emails we're talking about, the actual content of those emails, and the specific reason for either holding on to them or disclosing them to someone else within the church community. So not impermissible at all. Just again, important to think about the purpose that you've got for holding on to or passing on that information in the first instance.
Yeah, great. Anything else on that, Leanne?
I was just going to add, with the example you provided, as Harry mentioned there, it's very likely you have that valid reason to continue processing the information. You know, we wouldn't be able to say what lawful basis to rely on, but there seems to be a bit of a legitimate interest there for the church community.
Yeah, that's great. And all of this, again, needs to be laid out with policy, doesn't it? So people need to think through just a kind of retention policy, and again, making those available for members to have a look at and say, okay, yeah, if I do provide some health records for my child on a residential trip, then after 6 months those might be deleted, and outlining what that looks like. So please think about that. Is there anything on your website that will help people think through retention and some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah, so again, a lot of these considerations are going to be brought in when you are looking at producing a privacy notice, because one of the things that I'll talk about is the kind of retention element. So that's in there. And hopefully we'll make it relatively straightforward. It's like what we said earlier with the privacy information in general. These policies that you might have internally, whether they're about retention or about anything, don't necessarily have to be massively detailed documents. As long as you're hitting the core points, you're probably not going to be going too far wrong. Alongside the stuff that's in our privacy information resources, we do also have specific sections of guidance that talk about retention in our overall guide to the UK General Data Protection Regulation in our for organisations section, but also retention resources in the advice from small organisations hub that I mentioned earlier. So dependent on the type of personal data and your familiarity with the legislation, it might be that you find the advice for small organisations kind of more helpful if it kind of breaks things down in a more kind of digestible format, or our kind of overall guide to the UK GDPR and the kind of storage limitation principle, which is basically retention, guidance that we have that kind of does more of a deep dive into where those obligations kind of come from in the first instance. So those resources, and also obviously importantly, like Leanne mentioned earlier, but we've got our helplines as well. So if anybody ever wants to pick up the phone and give us a call to talk to us about those kind of things, I couldn't endorse that more. We'll try and be as helpful as we possibly can.
In terms of record keeping for I guess deleting data, should churches be doing on that? Should we be documenting that so and so deleted this, or this email, or this records from this trip, or this residential? Should we be keeping a checklist or a kind of a data store of who did that, when it happened?
I was going to say not necessarily, only because if, for example, if someone's relying on consent as their lawful basis and an individual exercises their right to get data deleted, are you really deleting it if you're still obtaining little bits, little dribs and drabs here and there about data that's actually being collected? I think if you're securely destroying the information because it's no longer needed, you don't have that legal requirement, you don't have that lawful basis, then I think you're safe to securely destroy the information.
Can I ask you a question about moving on to kind of accountability and I mean, one of the things that churches do, I just think for us here at our church, we participate with other churches and other organizations to, deliver food to people in a kind of food bank situation. And there is lots of information that's gathered for somebody to enable someone to get a voucher. And then they may exchange that voucher with us as a church to get food. We're then storing and processing that data. And I know I've seen and read through some of the policies that we've got in place for it, but it just makes me think about churches sharing data with other churches or sharing with other organizations to partner together, particularly when it's related to community or supporting the community, whether it be financial debt or food management or one-to-one projects, things like that. Any advice that people need to be thinking through in these areas?
Yeah.
It's really important to start just by saying that data protection isn't a barrier to data sharing. I think a lot of people are scared to share data and they kind of use data protection as a bit of we call it a data protection duckout. All data protection law does is kind of provide a framework for which you need to operate within. So if your church wants to share information, it's all about coming back to that lawful basis. What lawful basis do you have to share that information with another organisation? And are you confident that they have the appropriate safeguards in place to keep that information? I was just going to make reference to some of our checklists that we have. So if you're ever in a position, if anyone on the podcast, the listeners today, are in a position where they want to share information with another church, we do have a data sharing code of practice available on our website. And as part of the annexes, there's a very handy checklist, and it gives you all the questions that you need to ask yourselves prior to sharing that information. So as an example is why are we sharing the information? What is this? What's the purposes for it? What is this meant to achieve? Do I have the authority to be sharing this information, for example?
Yeah.
So that's going to be really useful when making those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely right.
You're absolutely right. And I think it's quite a theme of a lot of our data protection resources, and specifically the resources around data sharing, that if there's a real good reason for it, particularly if it revolves around supporting or protecting people, it's likely to be permissible under the data protection legislation. Like Leanne says, that framework exists to make sure that things happen in a proportionate and reasonable way. But if it is fair and inherently reasonable, the likelihood is data protection will probably enable that sharing. Obviously, the usual caveats like we spoke about when it came to retention and collecting information in the first instance. Don't pass on or collect, ideally, more than you need to achieve the purpose that you have for sharing something or collecting something in the first instance. But provided you do that, I don't think you're going to be going too far wrong whatsoever, particularly not in the circumstance that you described, where it kind of revolves quite heavily around supporting members of the community. Just make sure that you limit what you capture, and that when you've got it, you hold it securely.
Accountability then, kind of our final subject here. One of the questions that came in is it a legal requirement to have documents or evidence of the following: a record of processing activities and an information asset register? Now, we haven't talked about information asset registers. So, Harry, is this you? Come on, give us, what are your thoughts on this?
It can be, yeah, it certainly can be. I think a lot of the time, your accountability and governance obligations are almost going to be kind of demonstrated and most evident by the kind of privacy information that you actually have. Fundamentally, from a transparency perspective, telling people what you're going to be doing with their personal data is arguably a kind of core concern. There are kind of specific accountability and governance obligations for certain organizations, but typically they're really going to kick in when you're of a larger size, when you've got more than 250 employees, is what the kind of legislation talks about. So although it is definitely probably a good idea to have a kind of internal record of the type of personal data that you hold and likely what's happening with it, where it's going or what it's used for, that kind of just makes sense so that you understand it personally within your organization, within your church. The kind of real formal obligations that say like documents need to look a particular way are probably only really going to kick in when you're of a larger size, so are less likely to be relevant. Like I say, if you're ticking the box of having really clear privacy information that explains to people what information you're collecting and what you'll be doing with it, and you have a firm understanding internally of how that's going to work once you've collected something, then you're not going to be going far wrong at all. I think that's going to tick the box without necessarily needing to consider in a lot of circumstances that kind of formal record of processing activities aspect or information asset register aspect.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else to add to that, Leanne?
I was just going to say, please don't be put off by the term information asset register.
Yeah.
In the most basic of terms, it's going back to that list that I mentioned at the very beginning. You know, it's a document. An information asset register is essentially a document that the church has that clearly lists what information you're holding, so generalizing the types of data, as I mentioned in that list, why you're holding the information and where it's stored. And that information asset register is going to be so important for you to understand what you're holding so that individuals who are exercising their rights don't have to wait longer than the 1 month. You're not, exceeding those timescales as written in the legislation. It's just going to be so helpful to you to have that in order.
Yeah.
So please don't be frightened of it.
That's helpful. Yeah. Last couple of questions then. Is it important to list specific or categories of external data processes as recipients of data sharing in our privacy policy notice?
Yeah, so in terms of the privacy information that you'll provide to individuals, obviously important that people know what's happening with their personal data and where it's going.
Yeah.
We talk about being kind of as granular as possible in terms of providing that information. So outlining recipients of personal data, if you're going to share personal data onwards, is definitely a good idea. If it really isn't possible to say specific recipients, then categories of recipients, types of organizations is definitely an alternative in certain circumstances. But really, it all kind of feeds into that idea of being as transparent as you ideally can be. So if there's kind of no good reason not to mention an organization that you're sharing personal data with, then I think we would probably always endorse being as specific as you can to say, we're going to share your personal data with XYZ if it's possible for you to do so.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Now, GDPR was, 4 or 5 years ago was kind of big topic for lots of churches, having to step into this kind of new legislation and what we need to do to cover. So if some of that's dropped off the radar for churches, what are some of the annual things that we should be thinking about reviewing? How do we help people to not forget about this? Leanne, go on.
I was just going to say a really easy fix. Data protection isn't something that can be done overnight. We don't expect you to know everything as well. It's a bit of an ongoing journey. So I suppose the main tip here is just to set yourself some reminders, just to make sure that any policies you do have in place, such as your privacy policy, as Harry's been talking about, or that list, that information asset register, or the list of personal data that you are storing or processing, just make sure that the reminders are in place to make sure they're reviewed and they're up to date frequently, just like your training as well. Any staff training that takes place, make sure that that's updated regularly as well.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? Which is where we haven't spent loads of time on is the staff training and making people aware of this, isn't it? It isn't just a tick box, say, right, we've got these policies, we've got the privacy notice, and we haven't spoken to our staff about how they need to use data, secure data. This has been really helpful. Thank you both for coming on the podcast. Thank you for answering our questions. I hope our listeners have benefited hugely from it, and I'm sure they have. If you do have any more questions and we can link you up to Leanne or Harry, then please get in contact with the church office. Questions at thechurchoffice.co.uk. We would love to hear your questions. If you've got follow-up questions, then please do get in touch. Check out the website. The ICO website it sounds like it's full of examples, full of resources, full of questions and answers. Is there anywhere else that you would point people to in terms of training? Are you guys doing more and more of this to help folks?
Yeah, we actually have. We're kind of working on getting more and more resources is probably what I should say. So certainly stay posted for those in the future. Again, it's a lot of the work that our team for small organizations is looking at in particular. So hopefully will be particularly relevant to organizations in the sector. So there will be more that kind of looks at providing organizations with practical things that they can incorporate into their own training. So that small organizations hub, definitely the place to go. And then, as we've said a couple of times already, the helplines, tremendously useful. We've got live chat too. So any way in which organizations, churches might want to get in touch with us, more than happy to try and help.
Yeah,
Great.
we have a bilingual helpline in Wales as well. So feel free to pick up the phone to us. More than happy to help. And also sign up to our newsletter as well. So any additional resources, any upcoming webinars or events across the UK, you find them on the newsletter.
That's fantastic. Well, both of you, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for serving us, church managers and churches across the UK, with this podcast. Yeah, we're really grateful for your time. And if you've listened to this and you've enjoyed it, please let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. As I said before, if there's any questions that you could like to ask us, then please get in contact. And we'll see you next time on the podcast. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks for having us.